Hey Gregor, good to be back.
Hey David, happy to be back in conversation. Let's see what we are cooking up today.
Yes. So you wanted to talk about the shadows of a trauma-informed culture, and you warned me that this would potentially be a very long conversation. Um, and our intention for this recording today is to have a more broad overview of different topics we can jump into in this bigger theme, and yeah, maybe also include our listeners in how we continue follow-up conversations. So can you kick us off by saying, what do you mean by, first of all, maybe what do you mean by a trauma-informed culture, for those who maybe are not fully clear what that means, and then going into what potential shadow sides that are.
Mm. Yeah, and thank you for the reminder that I warned you. So that's trauma informed. Trigger warning. It could be a long conversation, and maybe it was a warning to myself first because, as usual, I like to go into the complexities of things, and there's a lot in there. So our idea was to have a first conversation and then see where it takes us. So why I want to talk about this is kind of like paradoxical in itself because I do work a lot with trauma informed perspectives, and it's something I use in my work, but I also explicitly teach in certain contents and also bring that to people that work with people, and also bringing that to people in leadership and facilitation work. And that's a bit already the maybe a mirror of my own development in life, and that maybe I think goes for most people. So the way I grew up, and I think still the majority of people that growing up right now don't grow up into a world that is trauma informed. And what I mean by that is that we are to large extents often not very sensitized to how personal and individual and even collective traumas that we all the wounds that we still carry are informing our so-called rational way of being in the world, how we approach ourselves, how we approach relationships, how we approach work, how we approach parenting, how we approach even dealing with the problems we have on global scale in the world, call it climate crisis, wars, and so on. And that we're kind of start from a naive assumption that we're all rational. Maybe we have some stuff, but it's in the past. And now we can just negotiate our way through life, and also expect that other people will, to a large part, be handling things rationally or from a less triggered place. And when then we meet difficulties in ourselves or in other people, we have then labels for that. This is emotional, this is regression, this is insanity, this is delusion,
Or this is evil.
this is evil. Like, depending on your worldview, we have many nice labels for that, so that we have a sense making of why people that are not um, coming from a whatever it is that we call rational, which again, that would be a discussion in itself already, which one we had, what we call normal, basically. There's this new book coming out from, or it came out from Gabor Mate, where he made that a big question. So the myth of normal, is there something that is normal? Or are we just a collection, or at least like strongly influenced by collections of unintegrated wounds that shaped really our identities, that shaped our perceptions of the world, that shapes our worldviews and our beliefs and values, often in ways that we are not aware of. So that's what it means in a simple way for me to live in a world where we're not trauma informed, which then also means we're unconsciously compelled to recreate out of this unintegrated patterns to create more trauma and to create more patterns. And so we're a trauma-inducing society, because what I don't know about myself and I cannot see, I cannot change. And I will just, I'm what Freud famously called repetition compulsion. We're forced to repeat out of what we haven't integrated. Until somebody goes like, wait a moment, and this is happening now individually. It happened for me individually at one point early in my life, and it happens now more and more also collectively, where somebody says like, wait a moment, like what is going on? And is this just evil, or that some people are just less developed, or some people just dumb, and we should just stop religion and then we wouldn't have wars, or we should have more religion then we wouldn't have wars, or whatever the conversation is that you're coming from, because everybody has often a quick fix idea of what we would need, what other people would need to do differently so that the world would be a better place. And it, of course, doesn't work. And we all know that when we enter with that mindset into a relationship, when I know very clearly what you need to change so that my life's better, it's not getting better. So when we start to become aware, it's a bit more complex, and what I meet in other people or in myself is not just wrong, but is actually, that's trauma language, an outdated pattern of surviving, or that has helped us to survive through something very difficult, and is now stuck in an old time, in an old past, so to say, and is not updated yet to the current experience. If I become aware of that, I become more compassionate, and I become also ideally more, I have more discrimination and more judgment, but not in a negative sense, more clarity around why people in certain ways act in ways that don't make any sense. Maybe not even making sense to them, but we're just stuck in patterns that once worked, but now are actually recreating hurt and pain. And so that perspective starts to be the beginning of what I would say is trauma aware, trauma informed. And for me, that happened early on in my 20s, I would say, when I started to read. The first book I really read was like from Peter Levine, Waking Up the Tiger, Waking the Tiger. And then there's many others that started just around that time. It was like the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s, where this was coming up as a real rewriting of how to even approach psychology, where the neurobiology and the biology of our nervous system was starting to become a player in the field of psychology, which until then was not very much, let's say, or not in such a refined way, where we understand that there is deep-seated instinctual archetypical dimensions in us as human beings that are really way low below the rational level, that inform us without us even knowing. And so becoming aware of that is a huge game changer, because you start to become compassionate and aware of something which until then was just something you could just label, judge, try to get away, or try to hide. And suddenly it's something like your world gets much larger. You see yourself and other people in really a new light and with context. You put the person that you meet right now and yourself in a biographical, historical, and even collective context. What you're going through when you're having a fit, when you're struggling in a relationship, when you're overwhelmed at work, is not just your personal failing or difficulty. It actually is something that fits perfectly into a larger context in which that starts to make sense. And what that reduces is shaming, basically. Shaming of yourself, shaming of others. It reduces judgment, and that can bring more compassion. And compassion is a huge conducive for healing, for integration, and for more love, basically, and also for more intelligence. I think that I would say is the game changer, to come from a place where we're not aware of trauma, where we become aware of trauma to whatever extent, which is also an endless journey. And
Yeah, maybe just I would add to this list of what you were just saying. One thing that it also does for me is it stops the narrative that uh, the mind or the rational thinking is like the ultimate capacity we have, and we have to control everything below it. And there's a kind of uh, like everything below it is kind of primitive, and if we uh, let that guide us, then we're screwed. And so it takes this kind of like controlling anything, all the other capacities with our mind.
right. Yeah, and I control,
Yeah.
just to add that here, control is a very big word that we will need to talk a bit more about, especially in that context, in the beauty and then also then in the shadow aspect of a trauma-informed culture. And just to say, that movement that I described, it has many, 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 many implications. Control being one, how we approach normal, how we approach what is being a rational human being. What is it that we feel, and it is even way larger than all of that. It's a real paradigm shift if we take that really in. And I know I've seen that in myself, and I've seen it with a lot of people that I've worked over the years. If you really let that in, just as you described, it puts you into a different world. So it's a paradigm shift of a worldview, because it's not anymore, oh, there's this rational self that can control everything, and then there's some malfunctions in the system where that we take some pills or exert some more will or do something with it, so it should go back to the functional self. When you open that box, it goes like, whoa, this is so much larger. My conscious mind is one element in a much more complex world, in a much more complex biology, nature, in the cosmos, and I cannot control everything. And the way of trying to control is actually, at one point, more creating pain than creating fluidity or coherence.
Mm-hmm. I have a sentence that came to mind. I'll share it. Maybe this is not the right moment to go into it, but it definitely relates to these paradigm shifts. I read I read, I read a Facebook post from someone I'm not super close with, and he wrote that he's American, and he wrote, "Does anyone else Does anyone else feel like the world is becoming increasingly soft?" And then people started arguing and bickering in the comments about how that's actually a good thing. That's whatever, people are becoming more emotionally vulnerable, and other people saying like, this is how everything will fall apart because everything's people are becoming such softies, and everyone is triggered and so on.
Yeah, I think if you've been a little bit in the spiritual self-development, whatever else names we have for this scene, you've been around and got into this argument, I think, somehow, and on a big scale, like in the world, and probably even with yourself, because it's a constant conversation.
Mm-hmm.
How you're relating to will, to effort, to having to go through difficult things in order to create resilience. And also on the shadow side, that's where we, I think, collectively a little bit more came from, at least in my generation. I'm mid-40s, where this was called normal, and desensitizing was called building resilience, which is not the same thing by far. And in a way, that's already the stage for. So is that a good thing, that we become more aware, become more sensitive? And if anybody who has done this kind of work with themselves if you open to these layers, you will definitely find a lot more vulnerabilities and sensitivities in yourself than you thought you had. And then, is that a good thing? Does it make you weak and incapable of being in the world, and you go just all to mush and you become soft and you cannot do anything anymore, and you just give in to your whims and want to stay in bed and hope everybody else is taking care and that the world should get itself together? I mean, I'm making it very generalized and in broad strokes. Or does it feel like it's an increase of being able to hold more of the complexity of the world? I mean, probably from my way of phrasing it, it's already quite clear what I'm thinking about it. And there is no such thing that if you really embrace something new or a new perspective or even a new paradigm like this, that it will not also inevitably create also a shadow dimension. And this is good. This is how life works. The problem, however, starts when we, as always, when we get into something new and we go like, first is the stage of like, wow, the world just opened up. I can live in a bigger universe. I can understand myself in a new way. I can understand people in a more compassionate and even supportive way, because you become, with that new paradigm or perspective, you become a supportive agent without even doing something, because you just have more space for people's experiences. So it's powerful, and you go like, wow. And I mean, I went through that, and I go like, wow. And then there's also, like with every new development, there's a moment you get a little bit fundamental about it. It's like, but that's now the real new kind of hot shit. And what we had before was like a little bit like, old and like, yeah, happy that we left that behind. But what we got now, like that's the real thing. And you do this with everything in the world. And we all do this constantly with friends, with music, with a new lover, with worldviews. And it's just the way how the world works. However, and it's fine, but it's good to stay with an open eye, like, yeah, I'm going through that. I need to be like so identified with it. And then at one point, either you will get a little bit like, okay, you can explore the edges. What's the shadow of this? What's the downside? What's the dangers even of this? Or if not, world will gracefully or less gracefully make you aware that there are some things that you got maybe a bit fixed with your identity around again. And that's why I want to talk a little bit about that, because it's happening, I think, right now a little bit on a even societal and collective sphere, where we got more into a place where people become more sensitive about the inner worlds of other people. The whole dimension of becoming aware of our implicit racism, how the colonial mindsets are still dominating a lot of our world. And this is super, super important. Like the whole woke movement, and I'm neither for it nor against it, but it's like, it's just a natural evolution of life where people like getting awake to something. I think that was the original meaning of the world. But it started, and with time become a bit of a term for something else, where when people get very fundamental about like, but how that's the real thing, it's again a narrowing rather than an expansion, where like, yeah, but you have to be so woke and so aware of the other person's interior that you cannot do anything anymore that would provoke somebody to feel in a certain way. Again, this is a very broad generalization, but we've seen that then words like cancel culture and so forth become a term, and then everybody's having an opinion about it, and it's a huge discussion now. So are we going into the right direction, or is this going like really the wrong way, and now we're just speeding up on our way to doomsday? And everybody's having an opinion about it somehow, and not just an opinion, but like it became camps that where you gotta be on one side of the street, and if you're on the other, it's just wrong. And so that's one thing. And the other thing that I would like to speak a little bit is also what you mentioned before with control, because that's a very interesting topic. But maybe you want to respond to something I said before I go on here.
I mean, we could go deeper on any of these, but I think the intention of this conversation is to stay a bit more on
Right.
on the generals. Maybe one other thing I'd like to bring in, and you can kind of see if that makes sense to weave in right now or later, is would you say that the shadow of, well, let's put it differently, like it's been really fascinating for me as someone who has been very much part of quite progressive circles and communities, especially my early adulthood, to over the last years get more in touch with more conservative world views, for example, through like my engagement in men's work, and seeing like the different shadow sides of these different camps. And one thing that I heard that really like stayed with me, that I think is somehow connected to trauma informed culture, is, again, it's very generalized, but to say that conservatives identify with the winners and progressives or liberals identify with the victims of the world.
Conservatives identify with what? I didn't get that.
With the winners.
With the winners.
Like with those that succeed in life, and say like, these are, we should follow these examples. And then progressives identify with the victims and be like, we have to, we're responsible that they exist, and we have to make sure that this changes. And like my sense is that this is kind of part of trauma, like the shadow side of trauma informed culture, is this kind of playing along in the drama triangle and kind of like wanting to save the victims.
Absolutely. And I find it fascinating, even the wording you used when you say the conservative, because so as in broad strokes, I totally agree. And it's also like, you got to choose one side. If you put your votes in, for example, you make a choice. You cannot put two crosses in there. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work, which doesn't mean that in life we cannot find a more integrated perspective. But that's like those other things that we have to start with. And so somebody coming from a trauma-informed perspective, so more from the progressives right now, would say like, wait, there's not the winners, it's the perpetrators. Yes. So just even the wording that we use give connotations and labels to parts of life that are important, because is every perpetration bad? No, of course not. It depends on what you do. You need to perpetrate even new frontiers, even new ideas, new things for things to also work. It's the masculine drive, and you need the victim, but in its essence, which is the sensitivity to receive, and to reflect, and to let the world know how your actions actually feel for another person. So you staying embedded with the net of life. Otherwise, it's like my will. I don't fucking care what anybody else feels. I just gonna impose my will, my doing, my actions, my desires. Again, I'm generalizing onto everything. If you don't have that at all, nothing comes forward, or nothing much, let's say. And so you need also the other side that feels like, hey, this feels like that for me when you say this, when you do this, when you just put a factory here over in where I used to be sacred ground, it does something to me. It has an effect, and it's not only having an effect on me. I'm telling you through my inner reference experiences that this has an effect on you, because you're not separate. The masculine is more like, I can do this. I'm separate. I'm my own thing. And the other one is like, no, this hurts me now, but actually, this is for all of us, because We are connected. We're not separate. We're separate and not. And the grand scheme of nature and life, we're affecting everything, and we're being affected by everything. So we need both perspectives always to create the fuller version of life. And so in the political sphere, this turns out then to be called progressives and conservatives. And in the best ways, they can work together, and they all both of them bring something to the table. Or, as we are now seeing, we have increasing polarization where it's just like an offense, human offense. Like, how can you be off the other side? Like, when did you lose your mind? When did you start thinking? When did you become so dumb that you can even consider being that person, or even understanding a person's perspective? And that's when the divide gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and we're seeing huge effects of all of this. And yes, so that's the landscape, let's say, that we're in when we talk about trauma-informed versus non-trauma-informed, or the shadow sides of trauma-informed, where the interior of human beings and individuals were not considered so strongly for many hundreds of years. And I think there are references from very old times, like real indigenous cultures and traditions, which we, in my understanding, don't fully understand yet from a rational perspective. We also judge, label, and put our naive, hopeful projections there, or our rational, disconnected dismissal there. And so they are either savages or saints. And neither of this does them justice. But I think there were more intact societies that had a deeper understanding of these forces, how they work together. But we're a long time already not really connected to this. So we're going to hundreds or maybe thousands of years of like trying to find our way through all of this. So for a long time, the individual and how I feel about something was not that important. It was like how the tribe felt about it, how the collective felt about it, what was good for the collective, for the family, for the survival, and so on. And now what we did, we dialed up and said, like, but how do I feel about that? And what's the side effects of like having to dismiss pain that I've endured and just keep on going? So this inner world and how I feel about something becomes like a player in even in the mainstream world. And when I grew up, that wasn't really there. It was labeled, like when you were having a struggle with something, it was either your problem or your pathology. But now that this is something that a voice brings something to the table, is a really strong dimension. On the downside now is that we shift in a way a certain responsibility from what was before, like the individual has to get itself together, to whoa, other people, family, society are such perpetrators, and they create so much power or so much pain, let's say, on me. I'm so wounded by that, and it's their responsibility to be different. So what we do is not an integration, it's like a flipping of the responsibility or the shame. And that goes with people don't know about the drama triangle. It's something really good to check out when there is not an integration, but just like a shifting of power back and forth from different places. Just turning the cards basically around, where suddenly the victim was on the helpless side, and then suddenly it turns over, and so like, but now I have power over you because I can tell you you're wrong. And this is off. This is morally off. And again, in all those moves is essential wisdom. But if they become if we become very identified with it, it becomes just a change of the polarities, which is not helping to integrate eventually. It needs that for some time as an individual healing work. But if we get stuck there, we just turn the tide. So it's like the victims would say, I've suffered long enough. Now I want to have power. and I'm gonna find my way to make you suffer. And it feels morally justified to be on that side now, because the other really needs to see that what they did was really wrong and it's outrageous and they need to be punished. And as we've seen this turning around of the victim to which then the victim becomes the perpetrator, if this stays an unconscious dynamic, it's cruel, or it can be very cruel. And so becoming aware of your sensitivities is great, and it's very empowering, and it's a healing move, because you can only heal what you become aware of. So you increase your life. So again, the trauma-informed move. What to do with those awareness and sensitivities of place is not naturally given, and it needs actually guidance and maturity and ideally wisdom. Because before it was just, if we flip over from like, what you feel is not so important, just get on with it, to, oh, what you feel is all important and everything should be falling according to your feeling, is not integration.
Yeah.
Might be needed for a time to bring that back online, but it's not the essential pathway forward. And maybe just to complete is when I said we need to talk a bit about control. Even in spirituality or in personal development, more traditional approaches to life were to spirituality, even wisdom traditions, by its nature often were not very trauma informed, because this was not mostly developed in worlds where there was psychological models of the inner workings of people, or more, let's say, crude or less individuated versions of psychological understanding. So when you went into spirituality and you would meet a master, they weren't going like, how safe do you feel now with this? And what's your relational history to power and authority? So these were not questions you would get into, and rightly so, that wasn't the world. So you would get into, and you would hear more likely something along the lines of like, your salvation and growth and healing would come from giving up power and from letting go of control, because you're controlling too much. And this is absolutely true. It is true that we're all trying, we live with way too much control. We live in way too much trying to be having power in our small self. And there is a healing and a salvation that comes from being embedded in a larger sphere of control and power that is not in us. But then, of course, when that is not clarified for the Western psychologized mind, this would sound like becoming, being stripped of any power, and especially being stripped of control, and needing to forsake your own sense of safety, even the right to feel safe. So if this gets married with a strong history of when you have a traumatic history where you were not safe and you were disregarded in your own need to have some safety to even develop and flourish as a person, that becomes a quite unhealthy marriage, because then what is considered a healthy surrender becomes a collapse of your autonomy completely. And that has side effects, and it doesn't actually propel you, at least not in the beginning, to growth. So then we come into the modern world, we bring trauma-informed perspectives to spirituality and development, and we say like, no, like the control thing that we said before you shouldn't have, actually it's necessary. So we have a more psychological developmental perspectives. And again, it was something that I went through in my own life. I went more into traditional spirituality in the beginning, and it's like control, that's the that's the
we want to get rid of.
That's the poo-poo world, and like, and wanting something for yourself, like, oh, that's just your ego, and so on and so on. So letting that go. And there was something great about that, and there was also something in me like, kind of in some ways, not the the idea in itself, I understood that, but the way it was being transmitted then sometimes was like, didn't quite sit well with me. So then when I also found more progressive ways of engaging with spirituality that would take embodiment into account and the whole psychological model, and I found trauma where it was like, whoa, that makes a lot of sense. So in order to really let go of control, you need to first have control. And actually in the deep wisdom teachings, that's also fully there. It's just like not fleshed out with these words often. And it would take years for you to get it. And nobody would care so much. It's like, just get there, meditate for 20 years, somewhere on the path you'll pick it up. Now, what we figured out was like, yeah, it doesn't have to take so long and a lot of suffering can be spared. So yeah, there is a reason, and there's a real goodness in actually maybe developing a sense of safety and control and ego autonomy and wanting that you need, that maybe wasn't given to you throughout traumatic experiences that you had. And to some degree, we're all traumatized in a world that we live in. It's just, we live in a traumatized world, so you you pick it up more or less, of course. So that's the big move. And again, one can comfortably get stuck in the place of like, it's all about my safety. And especially the tricky bit with control, and I need to have more control. And control is great, but it's a stepping stone. If there was not so much sense of control, it can really become a place to get very stuck in, because life is not about control eventually. It's not even about healing your trauma eventually. It's healing as we go, of letting control and finding control and letting it go in a perpetual, constant motion. And what's a little bit happening, I think, in spiritual circles and in the wider world sometimes, is with this healthy embrace of, okay, now your safety is important and your control is important, that you feel well is important. It can become a narrowing down even into a more individual perspective again, where your safety becomes paramount to everything. And the tricky bit is that your safety is not anymore so much your own responsibility, or feeling safe in a larger world that is by definition not safe. Like, life is not a safe experience. It's just is not. That doesn't mean that there is no safety at all. The safety eventually comes from being in a world which has challenges, which has safe moments, which has scary moments, and you will die. It's happening, but it's not a problem to be fixed or solved, but an experience to really embed oneself in, and that creates safety. But when the other thing becomes like that, the world and the other people need to provide safety to me, which is what we would have needed as children, and that it's the right approach, then when that becomes an adult orientation, you can get very stuck in there, because it's not an adult orientation really to be in the world, and it will never work. And then you will get very, very busy either trying to fix yourself and making sure you're safe all the time by not talking to certain people anymore, not doing these things. And all of those things, we've talked about that before in other podcasts. I think about sensitivity, which is super important, but it's also, it can become crippling, or you get very engaged in telling other people how they should be and not be because you feel safe. And it's not an empowering stance that it can propel you into the next phase of your evolution. And I think that's what we see a little bit, where there is just a shifting of power, but not an integration, where life takes you on a bigger journey. And again, I can speak for myself. I've been doing this for a long time, and I see sometimes the edges of too much of a trauma and from work, where you shy away then maybe from conflicts. You're getting afraid that you might get hurt or other people might get hurt, and it's inevitable. And that idea that we can just go through life safe,
Yep.
good, and it becomes a very dangerous perspective at one point, because it will set you up with frustration, anger, bitterness, and yeah, it actually, if funnily enough, it drains out the joy of life.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
We're
that's my
we're
bigger take.
nice. Yeah, we're at our 40-minute mark that we intended. Um, I'll just put in something as a teaser for our upcoming conversations, because I think that was actually one of the uh, initiating conversations for this topic was around um, discomfort, like the kind of misunderstanding that trauma informed means I feel comfortable all the time, and there's like no sense of feeling challenged or uh, uncomfortable. Yeah, so just want to say I look forward to shining a light on this as well, because when you mentioned this to me, I was like, yeah, interesting. I can see that within me, this kind of idea that if people feel uncomfortable in a group, then it means, it's not trauma informed. And then I'll be like, huh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And again, it's like that interesting dance between where in the old times, of course you make people uncomfortable, and if they're really uncomfortable, probably they're resisting, which again has a kernel of truth. But it can also become quite cold and harsh and cruel, and like, I don't care so much what you're feeling right now. And eventually it's good for you. Just stick with it.
yeah,
And it also can enforce, like structures of power where I know and you don't know, and I can tell you that you don't know, and so on and so on and so on. And then we move to a place like, no, woo, like we need to be cool and safe and good with each other. And if one person in the room feels uncomfortable, we need to have a long conversation about how to make that
we need to
go
stop
away.
everything we're doing.
Exactly. And which makes other people then comfortable. And then, we all probably have been in circles where this becomes the paradigm. It's like it can be paralyzing because you cannot eventually do anything anymore because everybody always could feel something about something. Again,
Yep.
I'm super generalizing this, but it's worth looking into it, what kind of inner script you're following. And often that is in itself a traumatic response to life, where now it's like, oh, now it's okay that I can exert power by my inner world, because I felt often so disempowered in the world of power and structure and not belonging with the group of winners. And so there's a lot that we can go into the following conversations into this dynamics of perpetrator and victim, the winners and the losers, and the power and the impotent. And but the most simple takeaway, I think, is just like you said, it's okay to feel uncomfortable. You cannot be in life without feeling uncomfortable. You will feel unsafe. I'm saying this to myself, and because if we only try to get comfortable and safe, we're actually enforcing this feeling of separation stronger rather than deepening this ability to be embedded in life where certain things are inevitable, and it's okay. It's okay. Life is suffering, as one of the first noble truths of the Buddha. And it's not like glorifying suffering, it's just accepting it as a part of life. And what we do with it then can become very, very, very powerful when we take in the sensitivity that this hurts and therefore it matters and I can pay attention. It's not what we do with it, it's the way we pay attention to it and we allow it to be here. And this can benefit life, but it doesn't take us away from living life, from making mistakes, from hurting ourselves and others, because you will. And maybe that's the last sentence, that one of the shadow effects of this can be that we think if we just become very sensitive and very attuned and very considerate and everything else, we're not hurting people anymore.
Yeah.
And yes and no. If that goes from a real compassionate place, yes. If it goes again to hide ourselves a little bit from life or shying away from uncomfortable truth, no. This is an indirect way that eventually might create even more suffering in the long run.
Yes.
So there's no way out. There's no opt-out way of life. And we need to bang our heads through the different versions and just stay humble, basically, that we're on a journey and you're always on one step of the journey, but not at the final end.
Yes. So okay, let's put a comma here. And maybe just to wrap up, invite those of you that listen until here, thank you first of all, to also engage in this conversation and share with us uh, what kind of questions do you have around this topic of uh, the edges, the shadow sides of trauma-informed culture. What would you like us to continue the conversation on? Yeah, would love to hear your thoughts, feedback, resonance.
Mm. Yeah, just echoing that. First of all, thank you, David, for the conversation and everybody for listening. And yeah, I'd love to really hear what's out there because it's a fascinating topic. And again, I really don't. I just have my own experience, and there's a lot more that we can learn together. And I think it's a fascinating edge that we're surfing right now. And yeah, love to hear what you're thinking, what your thoughts are, and we might try to, or we'll try to weave some of these maybe into our next conversations. I think there's going to be one or two that we will build on top of this one.
Yes. All right. Till next time.
Okay, see you then.